All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. This is wonderful. It's great to see interest in, through their lens, photographing Freedom Summer. This is part of our celebration and commemoration of the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer, which the training took place on the grounds right behind the museum on the former Western College for Women campus, now Western campus. And so we have a very emotional connection, I think, here, the museum, with Freedom Summer, because I like to think that it's very likely that volunteers were traipsing the very ground that the museum is built on. So just thinking where we are walking, they were walking, and what they did collectively for this country, and it's part of the civil rights movement. So my name is Jason Shaiman. I'm curator of exhibitions. It's always a great honor to be able to talk about Freedom Summer and to pay respects to all the people involved. And in particular, I wanted to focus on a couple of photos here, and primarily this lower one. And Freedom Summer, the real positive outcome and the real focus of it was voter registration, because this is what was really needed and what was immensely lacking in Mississippi. Blacks made up the majority of the population in Mississippi in 1964, yet only about 5% of those blacks were actually registered to vote. So it was incredibly disproportionate. So Bob Moses, who is here in the bottom right of this photograph by Danny Lyon. And I'll just give you a little bit of a sense. Danny Lyon was the very first official photographer for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Bob Moses was co-director of Freedom Summer. He co-directed this along with Dave Dennis. But Bob was also had a larger role. The Freedom Summer was developed under the umbrella of SNCC and CORE. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. Now, those two groups were actually under a larger umbrella, along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP in Mississippi, under the umbrella of COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations. And Bob Moses was co-director of COFO. So he was involved in this really from the very beginning. His engagement with Freedom Summer precedes '64, going back to 1961, when he first was really introduced to the civil rights movement and became very active through family members. And Bob is most often associated with Freedom Summer. I mean, really, when you think of Freedom Summer and organizing all of it, it's Bob Moses. But I also don't want anyone to ever forget Dave Dennis, because they were instrumental partners. We unfortunately lost Bob Moses in 2021, but he was an amazing person, very fortunate. Many people here at Miami University had the opportunity 10 years ago for the 50th anniversary conference, which was the last official conference for Freedom Summer that we've had, and Bob was there and spoke. And I mean, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, the admiration and the respect that everyone had for Bob. But he was a very unassuming person. But Danny Lyon, as the first official photographer for SNCC, was really responsible for producing the photos that were used for all of the PR that was being developed and outreach in cultivating the volunteers, roughly 800 volunteers that ascended here over 2 weeks in June. Now, there's many, many stories that interplay with Freedom Summer. We very often tend to focus on the unfortunate events that happened with James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, who were the three participants, who actually, Michael Schwerner and James Chaney, were actually part of the training, and Andrew Goodman was a volunteer, that the three were murdered by the KKK on June 21st, 1964. But I don't want to focus on that negative aspect. I want to focus really on the impact of the voter registration. I mean, it's quite timely right now that we are approaching Election Day, so I felt that this was a very appropriate topic, not taking any political positions at all, but looking at the importance of why getting the vote out was so instrumental. And as I mentioned, very few blacks actually were able to register to vote. And a lot of it is because there were rigged systems. Just for kind of an example, if a black Mississippian wanted to register to vote, they were often given the Constitution. And they had to read a passage of the Constitution and interpret it. Now, this was incredibly difficult when you considered that most blacks at the time were not literate in the first place. So there were systems like this that were out of the Jim Crow period that were intentionally set to deny the vote. And Bob Moses knew this and he recognized it. And that's why he felt so compelled that the way to really change things in the civil rights movement, not in opposition to Dr. King, but differently, because Bob believed in grassroots efforts, and that's what Freedom Summer really was. It was not created on a national level. It really started from the bottom with his efforts. So he had already been in Mississippi since 1961 and had been working on voter registration efforts as early as then. But Freedom Summer was really what made the change. He believed that college students, the young voices of America at the time, were the ones who were really going to have that impact. And I often, as I'm talking with students in classes, I'm always asking them about, you know, what they see as the vital role of voter rights, even today. And thinking that if it wasn't for something like Freedom Summer, not everyone in this country may have that opportunity. So it's always looking back on that past. Well, Bob Moses, as he was organizing the training here, he was up here in Oxford, but when he was down in Mississippi, you can see that he's with a few other people here, Mike Miller and Martha Prescod. And what was really funny about this photo was that Danny Lyon titled the photo as Martha Prescod, Mike Miller, Bob Moses doing voter registration work. Now, apparently, according to Martha Prescod, this moment was not about voter registration. So it was really interesting that there was some difference of opinion. And what Martha had recalled was that there were families, such as this family, that are unidentified, but that they and their home were victims of harassment and violence. And that what this meeting here is that these participants in Freedom Summer were actually coming to check in on them and to make sure that they were okay. And that to me says an incredible amount of the character of Bob Moses. It would be very easy just to say, well, we've got this mission of voter rights and we just got to keep going to doors and doors and doors, but to come back and check. And I think that's what Freedom Summer really embodied. It was that engagement with everyone on a very meaning and very personal level. And so Bob's approach was through nonviolence. He, like Dr. King, believed in Gandhi's approach of nonviolence and believed that the way to do this is through bringing people together peacefully and peaceful protests, and through the Freedom Summer work. Now, I didn't want to forget this photo up here as well. We'll come back down. But this one's by Ted Pollenbaum, who was another of the major photographers. Ted Pollenbaum actually photographed for Time magazine and was on assignment. And this photo is of voter registration work within the homes. And it was very interesting thinking about these people who were willing to allow strangers coming into their homes, but knowing that they were doing this for the benefit of them, of the Mississippians. And that the volunteers were taking the time. There were a lot of classes that were devoted to adult literacy. And because one of the concerns that Bob Moses had to really take into consideration, there were a lot of fears by the Black community in Mississippi, as well as by the Black volunteers, that white volunteers would think of themselves as the saviors, that they're going to go into the South and they're going to save the Black people. And Bob Moses had to reinforce that, no, that is not what this is about. This is about helping and enabling Black Mississippians to be able to do what they needed so that they can register to vote. So that approach, and there were issues, there were a lot of tensions that I've read things about and heard Bob talk about, is that de-escalating the concerns of the volunteers and the fears that they were facing. There were some volunteers who did leave, not many. And surprisingly, after the murders, well, at the time, all they knew was that they were missing of the three, is that during that second week, because that occurred right after the first week of training, that they disappeared. And that with the second week of training, it had to be announced. It had to be announced to the second week's participants that 3 people from the first week went missing. And I know Herbert Randall had talked about it recently and has talked to me before about Bob Moses and his response to it. Again, rallying and bringing people together and de-escalating a lot of the worries and the concerns. Now, the other thing that I always love about this photo is that here Bob was actually going out and doing this. You know, Bob was, here's his co-director of COFO. I mean, he's basically at the top, but he was on the ground, part of that grassroots. He was out there actively working on voter registration. Now, there were protocols put in place. No volunteers were ever to go out on their own. They always had to be in groups of 2 or 3 or more. And a lot of that was for safety purposes. So that's why we see, and very often it was also encouraged that there would be pairings of whites and blacks that would go out together. Because I believe that there was this need for the sensitivity of having someone black engaging someone black and not worrying about a white volunteer, because it was the Southern whites from Mississippi that were the ones who were threatening the Black Mississippians. So I think this helped to de-escalate, again, some of the worries and concerns, particularly of the residents, the disenfranchised residents. And so this went on throughout the summer, and they would go door to door, doing this voter registration work, advocacy work, engagement in education. And Bob Moses, interestingly, after the murders of the 3, it weighed incredibly heavy on Bob Moses for years. To the point, actually, it was not that much longer, I believe, after Freedom Summer concluded, that he actually stepped down from COFO and went a slightly different direction. But it really wore on him because he felt in some way that he was responsible for what happened, because he and Dave Dennis were the ones who were organizing this. Now, the outcome of this, when you're thinking about voter registration, is that they were enabling and helping Black Mississippians achieve the right to vote. I mean, it eventually ended up leading Freedom Summer, I think, played a very pivotal role in two important events. In 1964 and 65, the Civil Rights Act, but then also the Voting Rights Act. And I think Freedom Summer was so instrumental that what Bob Moses and others were doing paved the way for future, for those to be able to participate. And Bob Moses also was incredibly involved. So part of Freedom Summer, with getting Blacks the right to vote, there was also the issue that Mississippi's Democratic Party, which was all white dominated, would not allow any Black representatives or any delegates. So he helped found the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who's also featured in the exhibition, and others became major figures in the work of building up another party for Mississippi that would allow everyone to be able to be a participant, and not just whites, in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They eventually went to Atlantic City in August of '64, because that's where the Democratic National Convention was taking place that year. And Bob Moses went, he and Fannie Lou Hamer and others testified at the Credentials Committee to get the MFDP recognized. Unfortunately, it failed. But again, what really was that impact in the long run is the Voting Rights Act that was eventually passed. So I think there were a lot of incredibly important things that came out of Bob Moses's efforts in doing this work. So really felt that this was very timely, and wanted to share this with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.